Hi, Soap Hub audience. This is Soap Hub's own Alina Adams. So you're used to reading her each day, especially for Days of Our Lives spoilers and Young and the Restless spoilers. And then she often graces our site with her great commentaries. Hi, Alina. Thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks so much. It's so cool to be a face, not just a name.
I know. I'm like, maybe we should make this a more regular event where we talk to the authors some too, and everybody gets to see them. But currently, we're here because in addition to writing for Soap Hub, I know it's hard to believe, Alina has other jobs and other things that she writes. And one of those is she's a novelist, and she's published several. And her newest one is coming out on May 1st. And it's called Go On Pretending. You may remember reading some of it a couple of years ago when we did an installment series with some of it.
Yes, it actually debuted. The first third was initially serialized on Soap Hub. That's where I got to test it out on a soap audience.
Yes, and I loved it. I remember editing that and reading it, and it was a really interesting story. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got the idea for this Go On Pretending novel?
Well, I've written several historical fiction novels.
Okay.
And my first historical fiction, which came out in July of 2020 and was called The Nesting Dolls. By the way, if anybody ever asks you, hey, want to release a book during a pandemic? Go, no, not really.
Okay.
And it took place during three different time periods. One was in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. The second part was in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. And the third part was in modern day Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. And what I heard from readers was that they really liked the 1930s section the best because, for obvious reasons, Western Europe gets most of the press for the 1930s and the 1940s, and people had no idea what was going on at the Soviet Union at the time. So the book I wrote after that, in November 2022, was called My Mother's Secret, a Novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region. And that book was set primarily in the Soviet Union during the 1930s. And one of the themes I had touched on very briefly was there were Americans who left the United States and moved to the Soviet Union. And readers said to me, no, that's impossible. I don't believe that. I don't believe that could ever happen. So when it came time to doing my third book, as you can see, I sort of get challenged and I move along. Sure. I thought about doing a story about Americans who moved to the Soviet Union. And then I started thinking, well, what would prompt someone to leave the United States and move to the Soviet Union? And what I came up with was an interracial couple in the 1950s, which is a decade before Loving v. Virginia made interracial marriage legal in the United States. And I thought that could be a reason, because if they truly believe the propaganda coming out of the Soviet Union, which is that it's a country with no racism, no sexism, no anti-Semitism, it's the greatest place in the world, what if they believe it? And then I had to go back and have this couple actually meet, because that's the whole thing. With a story, you can't just have it pop out of your head the way that it is. And just, you edit me, you know, sometimes my thoughts don't connect as well as they could, and they need a transition phrase.
I would never say
that. So you know what they say about write what you know.
Yes.
And the fact is, I have been working on and off in soaps for 30 years now. I started in 1994. I worked for E! Entertainment for a show called Pure Soap, which was hosted by Shelley Taylor Morgan, and we covered all of the soaps. And then I moved to New York City during the O.J. Simpson trial. I like to tell my children that they wouldn't be here today if it weren't for O.J. Simpson, in that ABC shot the soap opera interstitials because the trial, you remember the O.J. Simpson trial, it went on and on and on. And so soaps were preempted.
Yes.
So they would sometimes interject to say, here's what you missed on half an episode, or here's what you missed on the whole episode. Because, you know, sometimes they were interrupted on the East Coast, but not the West Coast, sometimes on the West Coast, but not the East Coast. So people were getting different episodes on different days. So I came to work for that interstitial, which was called Soapline. And I wrote those. And then I worked for ABC Daytime in general. They used to have a show called Mike and Maddie, which had a soap opera segment, which previewed all that was coming up on the ABC soaps. So I worked on that.
Exciting.
And then I ended up at Procter & Gamble Productions, working at As the World Turns and Guiding Light. I did the official websites for them, but I also wrote the official tie-in books.
How
For
fun.
As the World Turns, I wrote Oakdale Confidential and The Man from Oakdale. For Guiding Light, I co-wrote Jonathan's story. Then I actually did an online continuation of Another World called Another World Today that was officially sanctioned by P&G. So all this to say, write what you know.
Yes, of
I knew
course.
soaps. Write what you know. My husband is African American. Write about interracial relationships, but in the 1950s. And so I thought to myself, what if an African American actor works on the radio version of Guiding Light? Because as you know what they say on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog.
Sure.
Well, the same thing with on the radio.
Mhm.
Character was presumably white or de facto white, but
Okay.
it was actually an African American actor. Now, what happens when the show transitions to television?
Okay.
And there we go. So
Yep.
that was a long-winded answer, but
Sure.
the reason that I said it in the soap world is because soaps is what I know.
Yes.
And what kind of a conflict could you have for an interracial couple? Well, she's the producer and writer on the show. He's an actor. And now her boss, the late, great, the real Erna Phillips,
Okay.
a real person,
Mhm.
to her, well, we're transitioning the show from radio to television. So your boyfriend's got to go.
Uh-oh. Yeah. That sets up a good dramatic moment on that.
And that's just the beginning. It goes to
Yeah.
so much more than that, as I like to tell people. And then somehow they end up in the Soviet Union. So I went from Guiding Light and Erna Phillips, and also cameo appearances from Agnes Nixon. Agnes Nixon created All My Children and One Life to Live and Loving, and she was actually one of Erna Phillips's proteges.
Okay.
So she shows up. We also have appearances from Theo Goetz, who played Papa Bauer, and Shanita Bauer, who played Bert. So we are right there. And I had all this inside information because having worked at Guiding Light, I had access to a lot of documents and files about what those early days on the set were really like. So I was able to put all that into the story. For instance, we even did this on Soap Hub. We told a story how there was a Thanksgiving episode where the cameraman had to go around the table. And so Theo Goetz, who played Papa Bauer, and this is a man in his 60s, had to duck every single time that the cameraman, and so he kept sinking lower and lower. On its final pass, he was like practically almost like this.
Oh gosh.
Because this was in the days before they really got the hang of, multi-cameras and all of that. So there's a lot of inside stories like that about behind the scenes on the early days of Guiding Light.
Also, that's what I wanted to touch on a little bit is after you've written about soap operas professionally for so long, how was it to kind of fictionalize some of that? How did that feel and be so personal with it?
Nerve-wracking, because here's the problem. Erna Phillips was a real person.
Yes, I know.
There is a lot of writing about Erna Phillips, including her own unpublished autobiography, but it is available in her archives. She donated a lot of papers after her death. There's a great book by Jennifer Keshen Armstrong, which is When Women Invented Television. She has a whole chapter on Erna Phillips. So there's quite a bit written on Erna Phillips. So I feel like I kind of know who she was as a person, but here's where the guilt comes in. I put her in a situation that she was never in, as far as I know. And the fact is, Erna Phillips was quite progressive for her day. Erna Phillips introduced, stories about single mothers without judging them. Erna Phillips wrote about the troubles that war veterans had coming back from both World War I and World War II. She wrote a lot of women-led shows, which was quite revolutionary at the time. Guiding Light was among the first shows to have contract players who were African American. They had, believe it or not, imagine this cast: James Earl Jones, Billy D. Williams, Cecily Tyson, Ruby Dee. These were some of the first American actors, contract players on Guiding Light. So the show was very progressive for its day, but as far as I know, the real life Erna Phillips never faced a situation like this, where she had an African American radio actor who was extremely popular, but then she couldn't transition him to TV. I mean, Erna really liked to have control of her shows. In fact, a famous story about Erna is when CBS told her that they were taking the show to color, because it wasn't Erna's idea and she was against it, the episode that they used to test the color, she
Mhm.
set in an operating room. So it was black and white.
Oh,
For
wow.
the whole, it was a 15-minute episode at the time. But so this was Erna's way of saying, no, 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 you're not in control. I'm in control. I'm
Okay.
Erna Phillips. So
Absolutely.
when someone says, here is an African-American actor, he's extremely popular on the radio, we need to transition him to TV. I could imagine Erna saying, no, 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 you don't tell Erna Phillips what's going to happen. Erna Phillips decides what's going to happen. But
Mhm.
that never happened.
It didn't, yeah. And
So at least, again, as far as I know. So when you asked what it was like, a little guilt-inducing, because I am putting words in the mouth and sentiments in
yes,
the mouth of a real life person who, quite frankly, is not around to defend herself one way or the other.
that makes sense. So this story tells the story of several women, right? But we've been mostly talking about Rose at the beginning. Which one of them came to you first when you came up with this idea? Was it Rose or?
It was Rose, because I was really intrigued by the idea of what would make a person leave the United States and move to the Soviet Union. So it came from Rose. Then I follow Rose's daughter, Emma, who actually has the background experience. She grows up in Moscow.
Okay.
The child of American defectors, and is a quasi-celebrity, because the fact is they were treated extremely well because they were used as propaganda symbols. And then she returns to the United States and sees the world from very different eyes.
Okay.
And then finally, there's Emma's daughter, Libby, who grows up in the United States, hearing the stories of her grandmother, who had actually fought in the Spanish Civil War. She was one of the American volunteers who went with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and fought against Franco, and then, defected to the Soviet Union. So her grandmother is this incredible, romantic, glamorous, revolutionary figure. And Libby, at 19 years old, decides, well, I'm going to be like my grandmother. So she takes off for the Women's Revolution of Rojava. Rojava is actually an area in Syria. It's a fascinating story, which actually my younger son sort of clued me in on, is that there is this group in Rojava, Syria, that is fighting off ISIS. Something that other people cannot manage to do. And it is a women's collective, and it's all based on feminism and equality. And it's incredibly interesting. And I am a mother of children at roughly that age, and it's fascinating. But if one of my kids took off to do that, I would not be filled with ecstasy. You have children of roughly that age. You can say, Rojava, fascinating. That is so interesting that they're doing there. No, 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 no. You here.
Oh, here. You can write about it. No.
Why don't we watch a documentary about it? That sounds lovely. Libby takes off without asking her mother for her permission. So her mother decides that since it was her grandmother, Rose, who inspired this, they're going to go to Rojava and they're going to take that kid back.
Oh, good. Man, this is exciting. I have not finished, all the way through with that. But just based on the first parts that I've read, I can't wait to read all of the rest of this.
Well, the other thing to keep in mind is, so my background is in soaps. I have been watching soaps since I was 10 years old.
Yes.
I have been writing in and around soaps for 30 years. So when I write a book, I write it like a soap. And in fact, that's some of the feedback I sometimes get from editors is, this is too cinematic. It has too much stuff happening. But here's my thing. I don't want to describe a tree. A tree looks like a tree. A car looks like a car. I am not a description person. I know some people love it and they love the poetry of it.
Sure.
So I don't want to describe a tree. Yeah. And second of all, I don't really want to know in depth what's going on in your head, because the only thing that matters is what you do.
Yes.
So I tend to write my books like they're soaps, but like they're fast moving soaps, in the sense that it's like a highlight reel. If you were going to take 6 months of a soap opera story and cut it down to an hour, which is what I used to do back in the day, because I was such a hip and cool child that as a teenager, I actually bought 2 VCRs that I could connect with cables. Yes, children, you used to have to connect them with cables. And then I would do these edits that my friends would actually call the Alina edit, where I would take, 6 months of soap opera story and cut it down into like 10 minutes or so. Now, if YouTube had existed when I was a child, I would have never left the house.
Oh my God, Alina, you were like the beginning of all of this, the fan edits. Like
exactly.
Sure. Edit.
I'm sure I wasn't the only person doing it, but now I think if I had had the kind of outlet, like if I had Wattpad and if I had YouTube when I was a teenager, yeah, like I would have never left the house. I am so fortunate that I didn't have those things, that I actually had to leave the house.
Well, that's so cool. And I had no idea that you did that. That's amazing.
But it all comes down to, when I write my book, something that I want to make sure soap fans understand is that I write them like it is a soap. I write them like it is the most exciting soap you've ever seen, because the scenes can click and I can change sets anytime. I can go from Madison Avenue to, yeah, I have an amazing budget. I can go from Madison Avenue to Moscow to Rojava, and I don't have to say, oh, well, you know, we can't really afford that. Let's put a tree there and call it Rojava. Now let's put a tree over here and call it Moscow. So I don't have to do that.
That's very helpful. I wanted to switch just a little bit of gears. How did your own experience as a Soviet immigrant influence the journeys of the women in your book?
Well, we see the world probably through a more cynical eye than the average person. Because, you know, there's always this thing of, why is it mostly that a lot of the art in any society is created by outsiders? It's because outsiders can see it in a way that people who are inside of it can't. So certainly aspects of my life as a Soviet immigrant affected how I see the world. Like there are scenes where Emma, after she comes back from Moscow to the United States, is meeting all these people who are explaining the Soviet Union to her. And she hears it through their perspective, the same way that they're explaining their lives to her, and what they say doesn't match up with what she sees. That's something that I think was a part of it. And the other aspect is I like to tell the story of how I said to my daughter when I was still writing this, I said to her, so do you think you could pretend to be the daughter of a Soviet Jewish soap opera writer and an overeducated Black man? And she went, I think I can do that. So the question I asked her, which was fascinating to me, I said, if you had lived your whole life in Moscow, and we had just actually come back from Moscow at that point, it was the summer of 2019. And we visited my oldest son who was doing an internship there. So we had just come back from Moscow, and she could see how demographically it was much more homogeneous. And we live in New York, so really comparing Moscow to New York, it looks very, very different. And I said to her, if you had lived your whole life in Moscow and came to New York, what would be the first thing that would sort of strike you visually? And she said something I never would have thought of. She said hair. She said, I would have been stunned by all the different types of hair there is and all the different ways that you can style your hair, especially if this character was biracial growing up in Moscow, where, you know, the Soviet Union is such a wonderfully non-racist place that certainly she never, ever felt like people were looking at her or anything else. And I even actually added something from my own life. So my daughter, she has pretty long hair, and she was younger, as you know, it is with younger kids, you can't just let it go wild, because that is how dirt and lice, my total fear of that's like the scariest thing in the world, is that if the word lice, that's a very triggering word for me. So, you know, you've got to keep it under some kind of control. And the only thing I really knew how to do was braids, because that's the other thing. Coming from the Soviet Union, that's all girls do. I had braids until I was in high school. It's either 2 braids or 1 braids. And so I would braid my daughter's hair, but my daughter's hair was not made for those type of braids. And it would sort of turn, and it would turn into a little fishtail because of how it curled. And so that is another piece of experience that the character of Emma, who grows up biracial in Moscow with her mother insisting, oh yes, this is a totally egalitarian society. Nobody notices that you're different. And she would insist on braiding her daughter's hair because that's how the other girls do it, not addressing the fact that her hair wasn't made for that type of braid. So it was sort of like these little experiences. One of the things is, so I have 2 sons and a daughter, and my younger son, the one who told me about Rojava, he and I have an ongoing discussion about so many, many things. And one of the things he always talks about is, why do you need to memorize anything when you can look anything up these days? My comment to him is, you can't look something up if you don't know it existed. You're not going to look up the Louisiana Purchase if you don't know there was not a Louisiana Purchase.
Well, you're right. Yes.
Which actually brings me to, I do have a point. It sounds like I'm going off on a tangent, but I another point to this, is that anyone can sort of look up any historical event. You can look up the start and the end dates of World War II. You can look up the 1957 World Youth Festival, which is actually a setting in the book, in Go On Pretending, where the characters actually go there. It's a big, you can look all that up, but it's the little details, the stuff that come from you personally, that I think make a story come alive. So like the detail about the hair, it was something that was a combination of both my daughter's observation and my personal experience. And that's not the kind of thing that you're going to find in a history book. And that's actually one of the things I love about historical fiction. Yes. When people write about areas that they're familiar with, you're going to get the things that are not going to be found in the history books. Yeah. And I think that's what makes the story come alive, and it makes the characters come alive.
That makes sense. Do you think that there's any big misconceptions that Americans have about Soviet life?
Oh, there are so many. We need to do this as a 14-parter, streaming on Netflix. I have had people ask me, was the Soviet Union in black and white?
Oh, okay.
Yes. I have had people ask me, do people ever smile in the Soviet Union? So it ranges from that to, do you remember, who was it that sang? Was it Sting? Don't the Russians love their children too? Was it Sting? It was somebody. It was somebody. And it's like, yes. And this is completely irrelevant to the form of government that they have, because individual people love it. So the misconceptions are from the broad to the tiny. And that's actually one of the things that I try to do in Go On Pretending, is to show what people's everyday lives were like, which is different from what was available in the media. But I do actually have a scene which is taken from a real show that Phil Donahue did in the late 1980s, very soon after Gorbachev came to power and was trying to show how he was trying to make a new Soviet Union. They started forming these partnerships with American media companies. And there is a show that Phil Donahue did with Vladimir Kovsner, who was his Soviet counterpart, where they do address some of those misconceptions. And it's kind of an interesting propaganda war between the two of them. Well, we say this, well, we say that. And it's the idea was they had American citizens in a studio and Soviet citizens in a studio, and it was supposed to be a free and open conversation. It was obviously not a free and open conversation. Then it was edited down even on top of that, but it was a good sense of what people believe about the other side.
Okay. So this book is so exciting and interesting and covers such a wide range of topics, is perfect for soap opera fans. What do you hope that the readers of your book feel after they finish the book, or what questions do you want them to ask?
Well, it was more that I would like them to see that the world is different or bigger than they think, because everyone sort of have their own preconceived notions. Like I have been told about my Soviet historical fiction, oh, you don't really know what immigrant families are like. Like, really? So. And then I was told, well, you don't really know what interracial families are like. I was talking to my cousin about it, and I said to her about how, people said I don't know what immigrant families are like, and she laughed. And then I said, and then they said they don't know what interracial families are like, and there was like this dead silence. And then she goes, oh, I'm sorry, I laughed so hard on the first one, I didn't have anything left for the second. So people have these conceptions. This is what immigrants are like. This is what African Americans are like. This is what interracial families are like. And I hope to give them a very different perspective. Not to say that the families or the people that I write about are what everyone is like. It's the fact that everyone's different. It's like, you've met one. And that's pretty much what it is.
Very true. So you touched on how you've written this like the greatest, most interesting highlight reel of soap operas. If you see Go On Pretending adapted for the screen, what is your dream casting for Rose, Emma, and Libby?
Well, for Emma, it's easy. For Emma, it's definitely Rashida Jones. When I was writing it, definitely Rashida Jones. For Rose, who is the woman? She's in, is it Fleabag? Phoebe Waller?
Yes.
Yeah.
If I write this into an article too, I will look that up. Who the
Yeah, it's Phoebe Waller something. Yeah, so definitely her. Now it's going to get tricky because for Jonas, the person I have in mind was actually Rex Ingram, who was a movie star in the 1940s and might have been in 1962 the first African-American contract player on A Brighter Day.
Wow.
I've gotten mixed sources on this.
Okay.
Some claim Rex Ingram was the first contract player, and some claim that it was Guiding Light with, I believe, Billy D. Williams and Cicely Tyson. But as long as I'm dreamcasting, I'm casting out of time, so it doesn't really matter. People say, so yes, those are the ones I was thinking about for the casting.
That's exciting.
The book officially drops on May 1, and yes, May 1st, May Day, when my publisher and I were talking about the date, I picked that because May Day is such a major holiday in the Soviet Union, and one in which, people are forced to go out and parade and scream about how much they love and how happy they are. So the book drops on May 1st, and so to celebrate, I am going to be on Alan Locker's show, The Locker Room, and we are going to talk about Erna Phillips and soaps and diversity on daytime and soap opera tie-ins, because Alan and I were actually both at Procter & Gamble when those books were released, so he was a part of it too. So yes, and I would love to have as many soap fans as possible come, because I'd love to answer questions and just to say hello.